Pa.
Good night.
Good night, Billy.
Good night, Mom.
Good night.
Good night, Bernard.
Good night, Mrs. Toohey.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Corey.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, sir.
Good night, Abraham.
Good night, Kevin.
Good night, Ben.
Good night, Mr. Wayne.
Good night, sweet prince.
Good night, Howard.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Fester.
Well, good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, sweetheart.
Good night.
Good night, Mommy.
Good night, ladies.
Good night, fancy face.
Good night.